Andrew worked as a presenter for the BBC under 6 director generals, we think, and 2 people who had to act up as DGs after sudden resignations. Andrew, is this, I mean, this is perhaps predictable that the BBC tends to do nothing, underreact, and then someone eventually has to carry the can. What do you make of this particular scandal?
Well, I think it's much more than the resignation of the Director General and the head of news. I think it's much more than just this splicing together to distort what Donald Trump was saying on January the 6th, though that in itself shows something of a mindset. I mean, what Donald Trump did on January the 6th was bad enough without having to make it up.
Yeah.
You know, his behavior that day, I think, was deplorable, and the behavior of his followers was even more deplorable. So why you had to distort it, just tell the plain, unvarnished truth would have been enough. But no, they had to go further. And, you know, Deborah Turnus in her resignation said that the BBC is not institutionally biased. Well, I think she's wrong there. The problem is that in a number of areas it has become biased. And the Prescott report, which has started all this, was not just about the splicing together of parts of a speech 55 minutes apart. It was about the BBC's coverage of the Trump election campaign and its systemic bias in favor of Kamala Harris. It was about the coverage of Gaza and of Israel, and particularly of BBC Arabic, which seems sometimes to be a voice of Hamas. It was about its coverage of transgender issues, which is a very good column by a left-wing columnist in the Times today, and how bad that has been. So it's across the piece, and it doesn't all disappear just because the DG and the head of news has gone. What's going to be done to stop this from happening again? What's going to be done to change the mindset that has given us this? Because if it isn't changed, the days of the BBC will be numbered.
But has it not always been that? I'm interested in, I mean, you've got a long experience of the BBC, as we were saying. Has it not always been thus, though? University-educated, left-leaning, North London liberals have always populated the BBC, certainly as long as I can remember. That's going to create a certain groupthink anyway. Is it worse now than it's been before?
Yes, I think so. The BBC has always lent a little bit left. I think that's true. But it also was populated by journalists who by and large left their views at the studio door and went out of their way to be as impartial as they could in presenting the news. And that's what built its global reputation over time. I think, though, with the rise of identity politics, with culture politics, excuse me, that's Iris, the dog disagreeing with me there, that she gets very worked up about the BBC. Iris, please be quiet. This is embarrassing. Thank you. I think with the rise of identity politics and with a particular group of cultural ID people coming in out of the universities into metropolitan areas, you can see that this isn't just a BBC problem. This is a problem that almost every broadcaster faces. I mean, Sky News leans to the left. Channel 4 News leans to the left. ITV News now leans to the left. ABC in Australia leans to the left. CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC in America. They all do that. The difference in what makes it so important for the BBC to get its impartiality right is that if I don't like what Sky News is saying, I just don't watch it. And that harms its economic model. But we all have to pay for the BBC whether we watch it or not. And that really puts an onus on the BBC to make impartiality its whole modus operandi, the most important thing above anything else that it does.
And the economics of this are so interesting because the licence fee guarantees them 3 billion quid a year or whatever it is. It's a regular income that is not dependent on commercial performance. It's just guaranteed by law. And therefore it's very questionable, and you wouldn't invent it if you created it now, Andrew. It's an anachronism. It's based on the old licensing laws. It's 100 years old, based on a completely different set of technologies that have been utterly superseded in the intervening century. So is the answer just to get rid of the licence fee and make the BBC sink or swim in the commercial waters? Or actually, would we lose something really important if we lost that?
Well, the licence fee was invented when Lenin was in the Kremlin. Think about it. The licence fee was introduced when Lenin was in the Kremlin. That's when Warren Harding was the president of the United States. And Lenin was rolling out his new economic plan to replace Stalinism. of what he thought would replace Stalinism. Of course, Stalin came back, took over from him. So it's a long while ago, and it's quite difficult to see this model survive. I mean, I think the license fee is anti-progressive. It doesn't matter what your net worth or your salary is. We all have to pay the same amount. And yet, in a curious way, given that we now live in kind of echo chamber media, which people, fake news is everywhere these days, you don't know who to trust, you could argue that a properly run BBC that put impartiality at the center of everything it did in terms of news is in a way more needed than ever. But if the general view is that you lean left, particularly on cultural issues, and you don't represent other opinions nearly as much, particularly in a number of subjects that the press report highlights, then you're in danger of losing that reputation for impartiality and for trusted news. And more people say to me, they don't trust the BBC anymore. And if they don't trust the BBC anymore, it has no future. So it is curious that the media environment has never been more challenging, never more difficult for something like the BBC. And yet you could argue it would be nice to have one at least semi-publicly funded organization whose whole purpose was to report the news as impartially as it could.
Andrew, can I ask you, it's a bit of an existential question, I suppose, and it's definitely a step back one. Do you think part of the issue here, or part of what we're talking about here, is that there is a bit of a culture in the workplace now, and we've actually talked about this in the civil service and in the public sector more broadly, which is that everybody has to feel that their views are justified. Everybody's justified in having their own personal opinion on something, even in the workplace. And that it becomes quite difficult for disagreement or conflict or pushback. And actually in news, that's one of the most important elements to making sure that you can make sure that you're not biased, because you have different people saying different things and you come out hopefully roundly in the right place. Do you think culture is part of this issue for the BBC?
I think it is a cultural issue in that the young people coming out of university these days who gravitate towards metropolitan-based organizations like the BBC are all coming with broadly the same mindsets, the same mindset that they've been given in university. And, you know, diversity is the great cry of the progressive. But the one thing where there is very little diversity these days in a place like the BBC is diversity of opinion.
How do you fix that then? Because if you're obviously you're going to, you've asked more and more people, governments have over the years, to go to university. How do we fix that?
You have to be much more Catholic, that's with a small c, much more Catholic in your hiring practices. You've got to go out of your way to get more working kids from working class backgrounds, more kids from provincial backgrounds, more kids from non-Oxbridge colleges. And you've got to look for a diversity of opinion, because it is the diversity of opinion that gives you the creativity, the creative engine to do good news. And part of the problem, I think, when people like the outgoing head of BBC News says that the BBC isn't institutionally biased, is because she's actually part of that bias. She doesn't see it. She shares all the general progressive left-wing assumptions of 95% of everybody else in the BBC newsroom. So quite often when they put stuff out, they don't even know that they're being biased. They just think, well, everybody thinks that. How could you challenge that? Well, there is no other point of view than our reasonable, well thought out point of view. And that comes from a lack of diversity.
Is there a danger that they're kind of neither fish nor fowl? It always strikes me that the BBC, if it's going to get this licence fee guaranteed, it shouldn't even get... I mean, the biggest newspaper in Great Britain is the BBC website. It engages in, and the social media presence is huge. It engages in clickbait. It tries to do, it tries to get most read articles. It tries to operate in a media landscape which is often a drive to the bottom. We all live in it. We all have to try and battle against that. We're all part of that, the commercial media landscape. But it both has a guaranteed income, which carries with it all sorts of concomitant responsibilities, but it also gets its hands dirty in trying to live in a world of hyper-partisan and social media. So in some ways, it has the worst of both worlds. It can't possibly fulfill its obligations, and it's sort of scrapping in the muck with the rest of us.
The BBC tries to do too much. That's the problem. And despite the vast sum of money it gets from the licence fee, plus the other £1 billion more than £1 billion these days from its commercial operations. It doesn't have the money to do everything these days. And it needs now to concentrate on what makes a public service broadcaster special. There are two things. One is impartial news, and the other is drama that speaks to our condition, to our history, to our current condition, to the country that we are. And in both these areas, I think the BBC is in some trouble. The impartiality issue is now huge, and that's come to a head. And so it's lost a bit of what made BBC News special. And on drama, well, the American streamers are producing just as much high-quality British drama as the BBC these days. In fact, in some cases, it's even better. Everything from Adolescence to Slow Horses to Down Cemetery Road, which is currently going on. So what is it that justifies the BBC still having this special, not anti-progressive funding mechanism? Can it really go on? I mean, I was listening this morning to some of the coverage on the Today programme, which is the flagship BBC.
How dare you, Andrew?
But only for the purposes
you
of
missed us,
appearing on
Andrew.
Times Radio to do proper research. So that was all. And the line they were pushing this morning is that it was all a right-wing coup. It was all an internal right-wing coup. Well, I mean, sometimes they just can't help themselves, can they? And the idea you would even attempt to mount a right-wing coup of the BBC with a Labour government in power with a massive majority just beggars belief. And it means that they just don't want to face up to the real problems. And people have been telling them this for a long while. I mean, the Prescott report came out of frustration that not enough was being done to identify this, that nothing was being done about BBC Arabic, that the American coverage had become unreliable and viscerally anti-Trump. And I think in the end, people just thought, well, we're going to leak this and get this into the public domain and see what happens, because trying to change things behind closed doors isn't. And I think the BBC over the past 2-3 weeks became frozen in ice because it didn't know what to do. It neither apologized nor defended what it had done. And indeed, the Director General seemed to go AWOL. He seemed to go missing in action and has only now surfaced to resign. And so I think all in all, it was a huge institutional failure. I think they're very lucky that they've got a Labour government in power at the moment, because I don't see a Labour government letting the BBC go to the wall. I think the Labour government regards the BBC as a bulwark, a balance against what it still sees as a kind of right-wing Fleet Street press. So I think to that extent, they're lucky. But the BBC could well be an election issue at the next election, with both the Conservatives and Reform deeply hostile to it. And that's not a comfortable position for a public service broadcaster to be. To be an electoral football undermines its very purpose.